Hey guys, it's Stan. For those that don't know, I have a podcast called Selling Greenville where I talk about this in a little bit more detail. But I am going to start doing some video shorts that I think you guys will find interesting, and this is the first one that I'm doing. So hopefully you'll follow until the end. But we have a very important week for real estate. This week marks the technically tomorrow, but in South Carolina we've kind of already gotten ahead of things. But the National Association of Realtors um, pegged this week as the time when a bunch of changes would happen in the real estate world as a result of a lawsuit that the National Association of Realtors had to settle on. And the settlement basically didn't do away with or really change anything when it comes to commissions for realtors. What it did was it ensured that buyers need to have a buyer agency agreement with their buyer agent, which a lot of states haven't had apparently, but the state of South Carolina did, so that didn't really impact us really much at all. But the part that did impact us is that now in the multiple listing service, uh, listing brokerages and sellers can no longer advertise whether they are willing to compensate a buyer agent. So if you're a buyer working with a buyer agent, you've agreed to compensate them a certain amount of money. Traditionally, or at least kind of the expectation that people have had, is that some or perhaps even all of that compensation that the buyer was agreeing to compensate the buyer agent would somehow come out of the transaction. Well, we used to be able to very easily see how much of that was going to come out of the transaction. Unfortunately, because of the Department of Justice considering the real estate industry to be in violation of antitrust laws, we are now no longer allowed to do that. Now, this has a lot of downstream impacts that I get into my podcast a little bit more, but I want to tell you guys one detail that I think is going to be something significant and something that happened after I recorded this week's podcast. It was not in there. So my company, which is CDan Joyner Realtors, rolled out to our company this week on Wednesday that from here on out, barring something else changing in the real estate world, which could always happen, our listings will no longer be offering any sort of compensation to buyers agents directly. Okay, now this doesn't mean that a seller can't or should potentially offer compensation to a buyer's agent. Remember, if a buyer is unrepresented, that is usually a bad thing. Or if a buyer is represented by a part-time agent that doesn't really know what they're doing, that can also be a bad thing as well. So generally speaking, if you're a seller of real estate, you want there to be a good buyer's agent on the other side of things. I flip houses on the side. I'm not just saying this from the standpoint of a realtor. I am saying this also from the standpoint of someone that frequently sells my own homes. I am very invested in there being a good buyer's agent on the other side of the transaction. And quite frankly, they have to get paid some way or another. Not all buyers are going to be able to pay their buyer's agents at the end of the day. And so sellers will still get that opportunity, okay? But if you're listing with CDan Joyner Realtors now, or ideally with me as an agent of CDan Joyner Realtors, what's going to change now is that there is not a set amount that we are advertising anywhere that you as a seller are offering to a buyer's agent. Now, you can choose to say, I'm willing to offer up to a certain amount, whatever that amount may be that's in your mind. But you can also just say, you know what, let's just see what offers come in. And generally speaking, I think that this is the way I'm going to recommend to my sellers to approach this. I have a listing in Planters Row that is probably going to be on the market by the time you guys are hearing this. And with regard to that, we're just, if buyer's agents come to me and ask, hey, is the seller offering any cooperating compensation or any sort of compensation to a buyer's agent, I'm simply going to tell them, if your buyer client needs assistance with that, go ahead and send over a compensation agreement with whatever offer it is that you are making on the house, and that will be in consideration. I'll also say, assuming that my sellers approve it, obviously all this has to be approved by a seller before I say anything like this, but assuming my sellers are okay with it, I'm going to tell buyer's agents, hey, they're okay with potentially compensating a buyer's agent, similar to closing costs, right? It's going to have be a similar conversation to closing costs. I typically recommend to sellers, don't just say I'm not going to pay for any buyer closing costs, because once you say that, then you've eliminated potentially a lot of potential buyers that could be interested in your home. Same thing when it comes to buyer agent commissions. I think that most sellers should approach from the standpoint of, I am willing potentially to compensate a buyer's agent in part or in full based on the buyer agency agreement that they have in place. But that's going to depend on the offer that comes forward, right? If it's not a good offer, then no, I'm not going to compensate the buyer's agent. And maybe the offer has to account for that. Maybe the buyer needs to come up on the purchase price in order to make it appealing to the seller to then pay for that buyer agent commission that the buyer is fully responsible for. So if you're a buyer right now, there's not really, I don't think, a whole lot to freak out about, because the market has softened a good bit. In a major seller's market like what we had 2 years ago, buyers, if this system were in place back then, buyers would probably have to be paying their own buyer's agent quite a bit, and that would be a whole different conversation. In this market, it's soft enough that probably a lot of sellers are going to find themselves still paying for buyer's agents in part or in full. Again, it's going to be all negotiable. It will just depend on what kind of offers that a seller gets at the end of the day. And so that's something that we're going to have to be tracking. But if you're a seller, this system is potentially really beneficial to you, right? Because it's just going to be a numbers game at the end of the day. You're not going to, really have to worry about, well, I'm locked into giving X percentage to a buyer's agent, regardless of whether they are actually good at their job or going to contribute or not. Now, this will be something that will be negotiated on the front end when an offer is made by a buyer on a property. And you could end up paying, less in terms of commissions than you've been paying in the previous system, or that you would have paid in the previous system. So a lot of very interesting things. Let me know if you have any specific questions. You can feel free to comment on this or reach out to me directly, as many of you guys already do. But I just want to update you guys with that. And yeah, if you need me to list a house, here we go. This is the time to do it before something changes. You might not have to pay many or perhaps any buyer agent commissions, just depending on what offers come along. So a very interesting time to sell. If you're on the fence with selling, maybe this is something that can push you over the fence. See you guys.